As a photographer, one of my favorite focal lengths for just about every bit of photography in probably the last 10 years has oddly been the 50mm focal length. There is good reason why it's been maybe the most popular and well-known kind of focal length for the last, I don't know, 70 years now or so. But today we have a little comparison, 3 different lenses that I have done separate reviews and videos on in the past. We're gonna compare the intricate details, look at them at full resolution, and kind of just see what the differences are and see if the more like ultra premium lenses are worth it over kind of the more standard pro level ones. Now, this video isn't sponsored. Oddly enough, I see that I'm wearing 2 different things from Indie Film Lab right here. They're not sponsoring this video, but I will say that Zeiss actually sent over this 50mm Otus ML lens a few months ago, basically just to say like, hey, we really like your videos, especially the ones that have like a longer term kind of follow-up. So I've had this in my possession for a long time now. I believe I do get to keep it, but there is no need for me to make a video. I don't have to do a follow-up or anything like that. But they just said like, hey, we really liked what you had to say. So if you'd like to have this lens in your arsenal, we'd love to send it over and just see what you make with it. So again, I'm under no obligation to make any videos like this, but I thought since I had these 3 lenses just like in my office at all times, having a Sony G Master lens, a Leica Summilux, and a Zeiss Otus lens would be a pretty interesting and fun comparison. So let's dive right in. Now, obviously there are going to be a few things right off the bat that are going to be pretty obvious. First of all, the Sony GM, it's the only lens that has autofocus. So right off the bat, if you want autofocus with your lenses and that's something that's important to you, the Sony GM is going to be the only one out of these 3 at least that you're going to be able to get autofocus with. Now, you can adapt a Leica M lens onto just about anything, but obviously it's going to be the smallest version, but it's also going to be the most expensive. I believe this lens that actually came out in 2004 is using the same optical formula as the current model. And even on the used market, I believe it's still going for more than both of these other Sony E-mount lenses. And so while I really obviously love this lens and have made some of my favorite photos of all time on this lens as well, I wouldn't necessarily recommend buying this if you aren't using the Leica M system, just because I mean, I like the size and everything like that, but you kind of miss out on a lot of the other things about the fact that it's just so small. So while I know some people have done that, I wouldn't personally say like, hey, you should probably just spend your money to buy this small lens just if you're only going to be adapting it. And then the final caveat I'll give about the Leica M model as well is that Leica, I don't know if Leica talks about it necessarily, but I just always hear people telling me about how the Leica sensor and filters or whatever, I don't know what the deal is, but it's more designed to take that really, really short throw that comes off of here. That's why if you've ever adapted a Leica M mount lens onto a Canon body, you get this weird kind of like vignetting issue that goes up in the corners. I haven't seen it as much on a 50mm, but anything wider has always been an issue for me. So again, I just am not a huge advocate of spending this much money on a lens like this just to adapt it. Just doesn't make that much sense to me personally, but you do you. All right, apologies for the quick set and wardrobe change everything. My wife had called me in the middle of this video while I was recording it, and I got sort of like distracted, taken away for like a birthday trip of mine. So anyway, do the rest of this video a little bit different, but that's why I'm wearing something else. Now, the Zeiss Otus, it is pretty large, actually. It's a little bit heavier because it's like full metal. So instead of this kind of like whatever this, engineered plastic amazing stuff is that goes into all the Sony lenses, you're getting more of like an aluminum construction. I mean, this thing is going to withstand like nuclear fallout and stuff. It's one of those things that this lens is going to be around far after I am gone, for sure. But this is more for the photographer that is able to have a little bit of time to some degree, unless you're really, really great at manual focusing. And that's part of like your internal workflow, and especially on an SLR style camera, obviously a mirrorless camera, but It's something where you're working with the tools inside of the camera instead of something like, you know, the rangefinder patch here. You obviously just don't have autofocus. So if you are doing video work, obviously this is like by far, like I would absolutely, if you were going to do any sort of like manual focus pulls in video, this is far superior to either of these other lenses, like in 1,000 ways. And then you also do get the contacts in here, so it meets up with the body, and it's one of the things where as you're focusing, it will auto punch in if you want it to do like your focus checks. The Sony GM lens does that as well, but the focus throw is just, it's like all like focus by wire, and there's just not a lot of resistance here too. So it just feels kind of flimsy, and I'm just not a big fan. It also just, it changes really, really quick. So as you're focusing, it's not a great, like kind of just detailed experience, where this is like just infinitely better if you were going to be doing manual focusing. But obviously the manual focus experience on a mirrorless body is far superior with the Zeiss over either of these other lenses. So let's jump in real quick, check out how they actually look in practice, and then I'll give you a bit of my final thoughts here. So again, we have the Zeiss Otus ML on the left, the Sony G Master on the right, and this actually is going to be the closest comparison. You can see that, again, I mean, I'm just trying to focus these manually focused as best as possible, but if we're going to like the sharpest we get, this is at 100% sharpness. I'm looking at this on a 5K studio display, so it's going to be really sharp. I mean, I can just see a little bit more detail here than on the G Master, but it's probably because the focus plane isn't like exactly perpendicular, but they're pretty darn close. I would say that if we're looking into some other spots, I mean, it almost looks like the G Master has more. Yeah, I can see like a little bit more detail here. So it's probably just down to focus if I was going to be as critical as possible, because these are also at 1.4. So both like look really good. The G Master doesn't have, obviously, is letting in a little bit more light, or it is down to its profile corrections, because Sony does things in camera that obviously the Zeiss can't do as much because they just don't make the lens and the camera together. But I mean, this is 0.7 meters wide open at f1.4, and yeah, it looks like the Sony here at like this 300 to 300 might be a little bit sharper. You can see more detail in the paper, but I mean, like, who's going to be doing this at 1.4? If you're looking for ultimate sharpness at 1.4, like, I mean, it's just not exactly the thing to be doing. But I will say that if we start to check out some differences in the Leica Summilux here, that's where you actually see some pretty interesting differences. So in the middle here, like the Leica is very, very sharp. You can see like at the 400 to 400, the 800 to 800, we're looking really, you know, nice and sharp. You're seeing the differences here, seeing some detail and whatnot. But then you immediately start to get that fall off into these areas. Like this 200 to the 200 there is really like obviously not as sharp. And then up here, we can start to see towards the corners. And this isn't even the corner. This is just the corner of this particular little image here. So again, it's not that I missed focus. So at the point of focus, we are plenty sharp. You know, down here in the middle, you know, you're looking at these numbers and stuff. They are getting pretty close, if not to the area. You can see the individual little DPI here of the print. So plenty sharp, but as soon as you start to move out, you can very, very clearly see, like, you know, you're almost getting some chromatic aberration even here, and this is very clearly out of focus. And that's part of the reason I think why that lens has such a cool look to it, is that at the point of focus in the middle, at least here, and as I kind of shift focus across the frame and whatnot to really get great focus, it's super sharp. And then immediately, even in that same plane of focus, starts to fall off, which for me as a user that wants some cool character and whatnot, it's an interesting thing that I can very clearly see, very sharp, not very sharp. And yeah, super, super interesting because I have never really noticed that before because yeah, you can immediately kind of see it start to fall off and you can see it up in here. Now, I will also add that once you start comparing the Zeiss to, like the Zeiss is like sharper here, and you can see that like you have a full little bokeh ball here. You don't have it here. You have the edge of this is actually kind of sharp, but on the Summilux here, it's kind of soft, and you can probably tell that it's like a little bit, you get more of like that cat, not even cat's eye, but you get more of like the, I don't know, field curvature or whatever, getting more character towards the edges. It's softer here in the writing in the front of the lens here where you see more of it on the Zeiss. But again, what I find really, really interesting is that if you put that up against the Sony G Master, that's where you start getting even more definition. So here you have very different actually bits of definition between the Zeiss Otus and then the Sony GM. So if you're like really, really looking critically, it actually looks in this particular instance like there's a little bit more of that definition on the outside on the Zeiss, which I haven't found in other images as much. But as we go onto this side, like you can see, like there's just more cat's eye and just more kind of definition. I think that the Sony looks a little bit more busy than the Zeiss, at least in this particular area. And you could probably, I mean, maybe make the case here just because there's more definition. But it is one of the things that's pretty interesting that as you start looking into kind of the details towards the corners, wide open, you know, that's where it gets pretty interesting. And then we can do that same thing with the Leica again and see where it just kind of tails off a lot more and is pretty soft. So I can't do like 3 side by side here. It feels often like the G Master, if we're looking like incredibly critically, 100% is like the busiest. The Leica is the softest, and then the Zeiss is kind of like in the middle of the two at times, at least. All right, and here is now going back to our like ultimate bokeh test of sorts. You can definitely see that the Zeiss ML is just a little bit softer. There still is some definite cat's eye going on, but I feel like the definition is a little bit less and it kind of just falls off a little bit nicer. I think I might have slightly missed focus, just barely maybe here. It looks like this is just slightly more back focused, but you can see there that tiny bit of chromatic aberration showing up here, where in the Sony you don't really get that as much. Again, I'm not really sure if that comes down to that maybe the Sony is doing something in camera more than the Zeiss is, because obviously Sony can do a lot in camera. So that could be the case, or it might just be down to the optics, but you will definitely do end up seeing some of that come in. There's a little bit more green here on the Sony, a little bit more green here up into the Rolleiflex logo. And you do still get it on the Zeiss ML, but you can see that both of these are very, very sharp. I think that, again, the Zeiss Otus might be just like slightly further focused to the left than the Sony here, because this all looks really, really sharp. And then it's, you know, you get a little bit of that chromatic aberration going on there. And it feels like, yeah, like the 3.575 feels a little bit sharper on the Zeiss than it does the Sony. So I'm assuming that just like millimeters or whatever of focus difference is going to be a little bit there. But it does seem like there's just almost like more sharpness in general happening with the Sony. Again, this is on the A7R5, 61 megapixels. We're zooming into 100%. So we're like getting way into the weeds here, but that's kind of just what the nerdy fun part about this is. And one of the things I think is really interesting is to see A, how the focus falls off, and then B, how the different bits of bokeh here are working. See, so like right here on the Zeiss, it almost seems like you get a tiny bit of like chromatic aberration here. But I think generally it just feels like slightly softer. Like this almost doesn't show up as much as the Sony. So it's not like a huge, huge, huge difference,
But I will definitely say that it does feel like the Zeiss in general just has a slightly smoother fall off, a fall off that is a little bit more pleasing. And then if we want to get into the Leica, which you can also see changes like its field of view a little bit between the two. So if we look on the right-hand side here, we're going from the Sony to the Zeiss, to the Leica, and you can definitely see that you kind of crop in a little bit. So you're going to get a little bit of a difference there. And then again, I'm just using the tools on the A7R5 to punch in as far as possible. But you can see that I think I did this possibly again. These are probably closer. So I was mostly trying to kind of focus on this little bit here. But I probably am closer to having focused on maybe the 75-35. They're pretty close in plane of focus, but obviously just a little bit off. But you can see that one of the things that I think gives the Leica a little bit more care is that it just kind of starts to fall off faster. So towards the middle, so we're focused kind of in between here to here in the middle here, but the Zeiss like pops out significantly more than the Leica does. But it's not like the Leica at, if you're looking at this like 0.35, and maybe we can even just jump in and go a little bit further here to like 225 or something. So if we're looking at like the little bit of the 75 there, it's actually probably about where this is focused. But you can see that like at the point of focus, if that's kind of where we're at, the Leica is probably just as sharp, but the surrounding areas around that point of focus, it's almost like the Leica is shooting at 1.2 or something instead of 1.4. It's not, because you can see that the light gathering characteristics are the same, but the point of focus is just so much more shallow on the Leica, which gives it its look, because you can already see where it's starting to fade off into the background immediately. And that gives it more of this chromatic aberration and that a little bit more haze. But at that point of focus, this is at 225% on a 60 megapixel sensor for a lens that's over 20 years old. So, but you can definitely see, obviously, like if you want sharpness across things, the Zeiss is going to give you a lot more. And then it often feels like, if we're really doing this here, so we have the Sony GM on the right now and the Leica on the left. Yeah, you can tell that the point of focus is a little bit further on the Sony here. There's just way more detail going on the Sony than there is on the Leica, and that's totally fine. But I think that it's then into the bokeh and stuff where you don't, again, see like a crazy difference, but you do see it once you're coming into like the macros, where it often feels like the Leica just kind of falls off in a slightly softer way, really. So when you're looking at it from this point of view, you can see a little bit more cat's eye in the Sony here, but it's not like you don't see it in the Leica. So there's obviously a lot of similarities when you're looking at something at more of like I guess this is 32.5% zoom resolution on a 5K display. But it's when you get into like the nitty kind of gritty bits of it, and you can see where the focus falls off a little bit more, even into like the Rolleiflex logo. You can see even from here that there's just a little bit less definition, but it's not like it's not sharp. So I think that's where, if you're doing portraits and things like that, the Leica just has that like micro contrasty slight glow. It's going to be a little bit more favorable to skin tones. And ultimately, I mean, we can go look at one more example here. All right, so here's a separate example that's a little bit further back, so it's not at minimum focus distance again. So you're not going to get as much crazy detail, but here is the Leica on this side and then the Sony on this side. You can see that the Sony just carries more sharpness across the frame. Obviously less chromatic aberration, but you can see where that would make a lot of sense for A, an older lens, and B, a lens that is kind of legendary for being great for portraits and having good fall off and all this kind of stuff. Again, at this like wider field of view here, and you're looking not necessarily at the gritty details. You can see that the Leica just has like a softer, less aggressive look to its bokeh when you're really zooming in at 225%. But is that subtle detail worth it to you or not? Like, that's where it's pretty interesting. Here we go with the Zeiss Otus ML on the right side now and the Leica on this side. I think that's where you kind of go, okay, like the Zeiss has a little bit of more of that Leica look than especially the Sony does. And so if we're really getting into it in that way, and I'm sure this is kind of where I'll wrap up at the end of the video as well, you get a little bit warmer of an image as well with the Zeiss over the Leica, and that's going to be a little bit more flattering at times for things. But I think that what Zeiss did a really good job of here is pairing the idea of having a lens with cool fall off and cool features and interesting rendering with also being a lens that can go up alongside like a Sony G Master lens and look really similar and give you a lot of those sharpness characteristics while still being softer in some of these out of focus areas and giving you a really good rendering and things. So it's kind of like obviously not a one-to-one mix between the Leica and the Sony, but I think that that's kind of where it's a fun comparison because you get a lot of aspects of both of those. So honestly, I think the Zeiss does a really good job of kind of being a cool bridge between those two lenses. It has a lot of the, again, modern kind of look and rendering of, again, a modern lens, while still having a little bit more of that character and fall off that you do get in the Leica lens. So from a like character perspective, it's really cool, great lens. I do understand that it's going to be a lot more limited, and maybe even more people will pick it up that do more video work and things because that's just more of a normal thing, especially if they kind of put out more lenses and you get some wider lenses like the 28, like a 24, like a 20, something like that would be really cool to add to the series and make this a lot more useful, especially for filmmakers. But again, if you really like that manual focus experience and it's something that doesn't bother you about having a modern lens that doesn't have autofocus, I think it's a great lens. So thanks again for watching. You can check out my original video on the Otus up here. Check out my comparison between the Summilux and the Sony GM up here, and I'll see you in one of those ones.